Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowed corridors of China's Forbidden City, where silk rustles against marble floors and the scent of jasmine can't quite mask the metallic tang of desperation hanging in the air. Picture this. It's 1661, and behind those vermilion walls hundreds of women live in gilded cages, each one plotting, scheming and praying to bear the one thing that could save their lives, say male heir to the dragon throne. But what happens when that desperate need for survival drives a woman to commit the unthinkable? So, if you are into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The Forbidden City, during the early Veizhong dynasty, wasn't just a palace, it was a carefully orchestrated machine of power, sex, and survival. Emperor Kangxi, barely 8 years old when he ascended the throne, was surrounded by a harem system that had been refined over centuries into something resembling a cross between a luxury prison and a gladiatorial arena. At the top sat the empress, followed by the imperial noble consorts, then the noble consorts, and cascading down through 7 distinct ranks until you reached the lowest tier palace maids, who served tea and swept floors, dreaming of catching the emperor's eye. But here is where it gets interesting. Unlike European royal courts, where mistresses often wielded power through charm and wit, the Chinese imperial harem operated on a point system that would make a modern corporate ladder look quaint. Every woman's value was measured in her ability to produce male heirs, and the competition was literally life or death. The numbers alone tell a chilling story. During Kangxi's reign, the Forbidden City housed over 20,000 people, with roughly 9,000 being women in various stages of the concubine hierarchy. Of these, perhaps 50 would ever share the emperor's bed, and fewer still would bear children. The rest, they lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, knowing that one misstep, one perceived slight, or simply growing too old without producing an heir, could result in extel. To Peldron, the palace operated under a system called the Green Head Cards, jarred tablets bearing each concubine's name that the emperor would flip through like a medieval Tinder, selecting his companion for the night. But scholars still debate whether this system was designed for the emperor's pleasure or as a psychological weapon to keep the women in constant competition with each other. The architecture itself reinforced this hierarchy of desperation. The Forbidden City was divided into distinct quarters: the outer court, where government business was conducted, and the inner palace where the women lived. Within the inner palace, the residential quarters were arranged like concentric circles of privilege. The closer to the emperor's chambers, the higher your rank, and the better your chances of survival. The lowest-ranking concubines lived in cramped quarters near the outer walls, sometimes 6 to a room, while the highest-ranking consorts enjoyed private courtyards with their own gardens and servant staff. But even the most privileged concubine lived under the shadow of the 3 submissions. Sartha Confucian doctrine that required women to submit to their fathers as daughters, their husbands as wives, and their sons as widows, in the imperial harem. This translated into absolute submission to the emperor's will, with no legal rights, no property ownership, and no ability to leave the palace grounds without explicit permission. The daily routine of these women reads like a choreographed nightmare. They woke before dawn for elaborate beauty rituals that could take up to 4 hours, their hair styled into complex arrangements that required teams of servants, their fingernails grown to impractical lengths and painted in colors that indicated their rank. Every meal was a calculated performance, every conversation a potential trap, every pregnancy a gamble that could either elevate them to the highest echelons of power or mark them for elimination if they bore daughters instead of sons. The palace records, meticulously kept by court historians, reveal a world where infanticide was so common it barely merited mention in official documents. Female babies were routinely lost shortly after birth, their deaths attributed to everything from sudden illness to accidents that seemed to occur with suspicious regularity. But what those same records don't mention, what we only know from whispered testimonies and coded diary entries, how some concubines took matters into their own hands when faced with the ultimate threat to their survival. The woman at the center of our story understood this system better than most. Li Wei had entered the Forbidden City at 14, selected from a pool of candidates during one of the regular drafts, where families throughout the empire presented their most beautiful daughters for imperial consideration. Like many girls, she had initially seen her selection as a blessing, a chance to elevate her family's status, perhaps if the gods smiled upon her, become the mother of the next emperor. 7 years later, she had learned that survival in the palace required skills that no amount of beauty or charm could provide. She had mastered the art of reading facial expressions in mirrors, of communicating through fan positions, of detecting poison in tea by watching how it affected the palace cats, who were fed drops before each meal was served. She had witnessed 3 purges where entire groups of concubines simply vanished overnight, their rooms sealed and their names struck from palace records as if they had never existed, and she had come to understand that in the Forbidden City, motherhood wasn't a blessing, it was a weapon that could either save your life or ensure your destruction, depending entirely on factors beyond any mortal woman's control. As winter settled over Beijing in 1668, Li Wei discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. Her first pregnancy had ended in miscarriage, whether natural or induced, she never knew. Her second had produced a daughter who lived exactly 7 days before succumbing to what the palace physicians called failure to thrive, though the other concubines whispered different theories about what had really happened to the baby. Now feeling the familiar flutter of new life in her womb, Li Wei faced a choice that would define not just her own fate, but expose the true horror of what women were willing to do to survive in the world's most powerful court. The winter wind that swept through the Forbidden City's courtyards seemed to carry with it the ghosts of all the women who had made similar calculations, their decisions echoing through the ages like a whispered warning of what desperation could drive a human being to do. Li Wei's 3rd pregnancy began like the others, with the careful calculations and desperate prayers to ancestors she hoped were still listening. The palace physicians, men who had spent decades studying the subtle rhythms of imperial fertility, confirmed what she already knew by the way her morning tea tasted bitter, and her silk robes felt tight across her chest. But this pregnancy carried a secret that made her hands tremble as she traced the growing curve of her belly in the darkness of her quarters. The child she carried belonged not to Emperor Kangxi, but to one of his most trusted eunuchs, a man named Chen Bao, who had managed to hide a dangerous secret of his own. The irony wasn't lost on her, that in a palace filled with thousands of women competing for one man's attention, she had found solace in the arms of someone who wasn't supposed to be capable of giving her what she most desperately needed. Chen Bao's castration, performed when he was 12 years old, had been deliberately incomplete, a botched procedure that left him sterile but not entirely unmanned. It was a secret that could cost both their lives if discovered, but in the suffocating world of the harem, even forbidden intimacy felt like a form of rebellion. Palace records from this period reveal that eunuchs held enormous power within the Forbidden City's ecosystem. They served as intermediaries between the outer court and the inner palace. Some scholars argue that these relationships provided emotional sustenance in an environment designed to strip away human connection, while others suggest they were purely strategic alliances formed for mutual protection. Li Wei had initially approached Chen Bao with a business proposition: help her fake correspondence from the emperor that would elevate her status, and she would share information about rival concubines' activities. But somewhere between the clandestine meetings in the palace's maze of storage rooms and service corridors, their arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had expected. The physical relationship was necessarily limited, but Chen Bao had discovered ways to pleasure her that felt like acts of worship in a world where women's bodies were treated as imperial property. More importantly, he treated her like a human being rather than a beautiful object competing for attention. When Li Wei realized she was pregnant, the mathematics of her situation became brutally clear. The timing made it impossible to claim the child belonged to the emperor. Her last recorded night in his chambers had been 4 months earlier, a brief encounter that had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, and left her feeling more like a piece of furniture than a woman. Palace physicians tracked every concubine's menstrual cycle with obsessive precision, maintaining records that could pinpoint conception dates within days. If she carried this pregnancy to term, the discrepancy would be immediately obvious, leading to investigations that would uncover not just her affair, but Chen Bao's incomplete castration, the punishment for both merciful kind reserved for political prisoners. Concubines who were discovered in adultery were typically subjected to slow slicing, a form of execution where the victim was kept alive, while pieces of their flesh were systematically removed. Over the course of several hours, eunuchs who had deceived the palace about their castration faced an even worse fate: public flaying followed by dismemberment while still conscious. Li Wei spent sleepless nights pacing the narrow confines of her quarters, calculating and recalculating her options. She could attempt to induce a miscarriage using the herbal concoctions that circulated secretly among the concubines, mixtures of pennyroyal tansy and black cohosh that sometimes worked but just as often resulted in hemorrhaging that killed the mother along with the child. She could try to seduce the emperor and hope that he wouldn't notice the timing discrepancy. But his current favorite was an 18-year-old Manchu girl named Concubine Rong, who had already borne him 2 sons and monopolized his attention for months. She could disappear entirely, flee the palace and face life as a disgraced woman, with no family, no resources, and no protection in a society that showed no mercy to fallen imperial concubines. None of these options offered realistic hope for survival, but as Li Wei's pregnancy progressed into her 2nd trimester, a 4th possibility began to take shape in her mind. It was an idea so horrifying that she initially dismissed it as the product of stress-induced madness, but as the weeks passed and her belly grew more prominent, the terrible logic of it became undeniable. The solution lay in the ancient Chinese concept of tiger parenting, the belief that consuming part of one's offspring could transfer their life force and spiritual energy back to the parent. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a practice with deep roots in Chinese folk medicine and Taoist philosophy. Traditional texts spoke of mothers who had consumed the placenta, umbilical cord, or even small portions of stillborn infants to absorb their qi and ensure future fertility. But Li Wei's situation required something far more extreme. Ancient medical texts, hidden in the deepest recesses of the palace library, described cases where desperate mothers had consumed newborn infants entirely, not out of hunger, but as a spiritual ritual designed to hide the evidence of forbidden pregnancies. While simultaneous, the practice was considered so taboo that it was rarely documented, explicitly referred to instead through coded language about returning the gift or completing the circle of life. But for a woman facing certain death if her pregnancy was discovered, these ancient rituals offered a terrifying form of salvation. Li Wei began to research the process with the same methodical precision she had once applied to memorizing court etiquette. She learned that newborn infants, if consumed within hours of birth, were believed to provide maximum spiritual benefit because their souls had not yet fully separated from the mother's life force. The consumption had to be complete, leaving no physical evidence that a birth had occurred, and performed according to specific rituals that would ensure the child's spiritual energy transferred properly to the mother. Most importantly, the practice had to be conducted in absolute secrecy, as discovery would result in punishments that made regular execution of merciful. As her pregnancy entered its final month, Li Wei made her preparations with the calm efficiency of a woman who had already accepted the unthinkable. She stockpiled the herbs and incense needed for the ritual, memorized the ancient prayers that would guide her through the process, and began the psychological condition that would guide her through the process. The Forbidden City's winter seemed to stretch endlessly that year, each day bringing her closer to a moment that would either save her life or damn her soul. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even the palace guards dozed at their posts, Li Wei would place her hands on her belly and whisper apologies to the child growing inside her, promises that she would remember their sacrifice, that their brief life would serve a purpose greater than they could ever understand. She told herself that this was mercy, not murder, that bringing a child into the world only to watch them be tortured to death alongside their mother was the true cruelty. But in her heart she knew she was crossing a line that would forever separate her from the realm of ordinary human experience, entering a territory where survival demanded the sacrifice of everything that made survival worthwhile. The baby's first kicks felt like accusations, their movements a constant reminder of the choice she had made, and the act she would soon have to perform when the time came to choose between 2 lives, knowing that only one of them could possibly survive the truth. The labor pains began during the hour of the rat, that deep stretch of night when even the most vigilant palace guards succumbed to drowsiness, and the Forbidden City settled into its quietest rhythms. Li Wei had been expecting this timing. She had calculated everything down to the lunar calendar, ensuring her delivery would occur during a new moon when darkness would provide maximum cover for what she was about to do. She had spent weeks preparing her quarters for this moment, moving furniture to create a secluded birthing area, away from the windows, stockpiling clean linens, and the special herbs she would need for both the delivery and what would follow. Most crucially, she had convinced her roommate, a lower-ranking concubine named Mei Lin, to accept a sleeping draught disguised as medicine for menstrual cramps. The drug, a mixture of poppy extract and valerian root, would ensure Mei Lin remained unconscious for at least 6 hours, more than enough time for Li Wei to complete her terrible task and clean up any evidence. As the contractions intensified, Li Wei bit down on a silk scarf to muffle her sounds, having learned from watching other secret births in the palace that even the smallest cry could bring unwanted attention from the eunuch guards who patrolled the corridors. The irony of giving birth in absolute silence wasn't lost on her. In any other circumstance, the arrival of an imperial child would be celebrated with drums, firecrackers, and elaborate ceremonies that lasted for days. Instead, she labored alone in the darkness, guided only by instincts that felt both ancient and alien, her body performing a miracle that she would have to immediately undo. The actual delivery took less than 2 hours, which palace physicians would have considered unusually quick for a third birth. The baby, boy, as Li Wei discovered with a mixture of relief and horror, emerged small but perfectly formed, his tiny fists clenched, and his lungs strong enough to produce the lusty cry that announced his arrival into a world that had no place for him. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Li Wei held her son against her chest, feeling his heartbeat synchronize with her own as his cries gradually subsided into the soft snuffling sounds of a newborn seeking comfort. This was the moment she had dreaded most, not the physical act that would follow, but this brief window when her child was simply a baby, innocent and vulnerable, unaware that his existence was a death sentence for them both. Ancient Chinese medical texts described the consumption ritual in clinical terms that made the process sound almost medicinal. The newborn was to be consumed entirely within the first hour after birth, while the life force was still strongest and before the soul had fully separated from the physical form. The consumption had to follow a specific sequence, first the placenta and umbilical cord, which contained the concentrated essence, and finally the bones, which were to be ground into powder and mixed with wine to ensure complete absorption. But the texts, written by male scholars who had never faced such a choice, failed to capture the psychological horror of what they were describing. Li Wei had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, but the reality proved far more devastating than any preparation could have provided. Her son was beautiful, perfect in the way that all healthy newborns are perfect, with tiny fingernails like translucent shells, and eyelashes so delicate they seemed made of silk. He had her nose, and what looked like it might develop into Chen Bao's stubborn chin, features that would have marked him as their child to anyone who looked closely. As she prepared for the ritual, Li Wei found herself speaking to him in whispers, explaining what she was about to do and why it was necessary. She told him about the palace, about the impossible choices that women faced in the pursuit of survival, about how his sacrifice would allow her to live, and perhaps someday bear another child who might have a chance at a different fate. Whether he understood or simply responded to the sound of her voice, the baby seemed to calm as she spoke, his tiny hand wrapping around her finger with the instinctive grip that evolution had designed to help infants cling to their mothers. The irony of that gesture, his trust in the very person who was about to betray him, nearly broke her resolve. The ritual began with prayers to the ancestors, asking forgiveness for what she was about to do and requesting that they guide her son's spirit to a peaceful rebirth in a better world. Li Wei had memorized these prayers from texts hidden in the palace library, ancient words that felt foreign on her tongue, but seemed necessary to maintain some connection between her actions and the spiritual traditions that gave them meaning. She burned incense made from sandalwood and myrrh, filling her small room with smoke that she hoped would mask any sounds or smells that might attract attention from the guards outside. The actual consumption proved even more difficult than she had anticipated. The text had described it in abstract terms, but the reality involved physical challenges that no amount of mental preparation could overcome. Her son's body was small, perhaps 5 pounds, but the process of consumption was complicated by her own physical condition after giving birth and the psychological barriers that her mind erected against what she was attempting to do. She began with the placenta, which traditional Chinese medicine had always considered beneficial for new mothers to consume for its iron content and supposed spiritual properties. This part felt almost natural, grounded in customs that women had practiced for centuries to aid recovery after childbirth. But as she moved beyond the familiar territory of placental consumption into uncharted horror, Li Wei discovered that her body was rebelling against what her mind had decided was necessary. She vomited repeatedly, her stomach rejecting what she was forcing herself to consume, requiring her to clean up the evidence and begin again, each time. The process that was supposed to take an hour stretched toward 3, with Li Wei alternating between periods of determined consumption and moments of complete physical collapse, when her body simply refused to continue. By dawn, she had managed to consume perhaps half of what the ritual required, but exhaustion and physical limitations made it impossible to continue. The remaining evidence had to be disposed of quickly. This palace would be awakening soon, and any delay could prove fatal. Li Wei wrapped the remaining parts of her son's body in silk cloth and placed them in a ceramic jar that she had prepared for this purpose. Over the following days, she would gradually dispose of the contents by mixing small amounts into the food she fed to the palace cats, creatures whose own omnivorous habits would leave no trace of what they had consumed. The cover story she had prepared was simple. She had suffered a miscarriage during the night, losing the baby in a flow of blood. that she had cleaned up before anyone could see. Miscarriages were common enough in the palace that they rarely drew investigation, especially for lower-ranking concubines, whose pregnancies weren't considered particularly important to the imperial succession. When Mei Lin awakened from her drugged sleep, she found Li Wei pale and weak, surrounded by bloody linens that seemed to support the story of a pregnancy lost during the night. Li Wei's tears were genuine, not just for the child she had lost, but for the woman she had been before this night, a person who no longer existed and could never be recovered. The immediate aftermath brought unexpected challenges that Li Wei hadn't anticipated in her planning. The partial consumption had left her violently ill for days, with fever and stomach problems that required explanation to the palace physicians who monitored all concubines' health. She claimed food poisoning from bad fish, a common enough ailment that it didn't raise suspicion, but the extended illness left her weak and disoriented at a time when she needed to be most vigilant about maintaining her cover story. Most disturbing were the psychological effects that began manifesting within hours of the ritual. Li Wei found herself experiencing what she could only describe as a doubling of consciousness per moments, when she felt her son's presence so strongly that she would turn expecting to see him, or catch herself preparing to nurse a baby who was no longer there. The ancient texts had mentioned that consuming one's offspring could create spiritual connections, but they had described this as a positive outcome, main way of keeping the child's essence close. For Li Wei, these experiences felt more like haunting than comfort, a constant reminder of the line she had crossed and the price she had paid for survival, but she had survived, and in the brutal mathematics of palace life, that was the only calculation that ultimately mattered. The investigation began 3 weeks later, not because anyone suspected Li Wei, but because Concubine Rong, the emperor's current favorite, had noticed patterns that made her uncomfortable. Rong was a survivor herself, having clawed her way from the lowest ranks to become one of the most powerful women in the Forbidden City through a combination of beauty, cunning, and an almost supernatural ability to detect threats to her position. She had been keeping informal records of pregnancies and births among the concubines, partly out of genuine concern, but mostly as intelligence gathering that could be used to eliminate potential rivals. What troubled her was a mathematical discrepancy that seemed too significant to ignore. Over the past year, 17 concubines had reported pregnancies. Of these, 9 had resulted in live births, 3 had ended in documented miscarriages witnessed by multiple people, and 2 had produced stillbirths that were properly buried in the palace cemetery. That left 3 pregnancies, including Li Wei's, that had simply vanished from the records, with vague explanations about natural losses that seemed to have occurred without witnesses or physical evidence. Rong brought her concerns to Chen Mingshan, the chief eunuch responsible for internal palace security, a man whose survival in his position for over 20 years had depended on his ability to detect and eliminate threats. Before they could destabilize the delicate balance of imperial power, Chen Mingshan was intrigued by Rong's observations, partly because they confirmed suspicions he had been developing. In the palace, his network of informants had reported strange smells coming from certain quarters during the night, unusual purchases of herbs and incense by lower-ranking concubines, and subtle changes in behavior among women who had recently lost pregnancies. Most concerning were reports from the palace kitchen staff about missing food, not large amounts, but steady pilferage of items that could be used to mask unusual tastes or smells. The investigation began, discreetly, with Chen Mingshan assigning his most trusted subordinates to conduct what he called routine wellness checks on concubines who had experienced recent pregnancy losses. These visits were designed to appear compassionate, checking on the women's physical and emotional recovery, while actually searching for evidence of activities that didn't match the official stories. Li Wei's quarters were inspected on a Thursday morning, when she was attending mandatory calligraphy lessons in the palace school. The search revealed nothing obviously suspicious, but the investigators noted several small anomalies that became significant when viewed in aggregate. The room had been cleaned with unusual thoroughness for someone supposedly recovering from a traumatic miscarriage, with new floor mats and Li Wei's modest rank and limited resources. More puzzling was the discovery of a small ceramic jar hidden beneath her bed, empty but retaining traces of what the investigators' trained noses identified as decomposed organic matter mixed with unfamiliar spices. When confronted about the jar, Li Wei claimed it had contained medicinal herbs prescribed by a palace physician for her recovery, but the investigators found no record of such a prescription in the medical records. Chen Mingshan decided to expand the investigation to include the other concubines whose pregnancies had ended without clear documentation. The second woman, a 22-year-old named Lo Yan, had reported a miscarriage 2 months earlier, but had been seen by palace guards disposing of wrapped bundles in the middle of the night. Bundles she claimed contained bloodied linens, but which the guards had noted when carried. The third case proved even more disturbing. Concubine Zhao had lost a pregnancy around the same time as Li Wei, but servants reported that she had continued to exhibit signs of lactation for weeks afterward, an unusual physiological response that suggested her body had gone through full-term delivery. His interrogators discovered that several concubines had been sharing information about herbal preparations that could induce labor, ancient texts that described unusual spiritual practices, and techniques for disposing of evidence that could incriminate them. Most disturbing was the revelation that these women had developed a crude support system, helping each other through processes that were too dangerous to attempt alone. The investigation took a darker turn when Chen Yingshan's agents began examining the palace's cat population, animals that served as both pest control and informal poison detectors throughout the Forbidden City. A disturbing number of these cats had died or become seriously ill over the past several months, with symptoms that suggested they had consumed something toxic or indigestible. When palace physicians examined the surviving cats, they found evidence of unusual dietary consumption, fragments of human tissue and bone that could only have come from one source. The discovery that concubines were feeding parts of their own children to palace animals crossed a line that even the cynical Chen Yingshan found difficult to process. He had spent decades managing the brutal realities of palace life, from political assassinations to torture sessions, but the systematic infanticide and partial cannibalism he was uncovering represented a new level of horror that challenged his understanding of what human beings were capable of doing. To survive, the final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, Chen Bao himself. The eunuch had been growing increasingly unstable as the investigation progressed, drinking heavily and making cryptic comments about paying for his sins that attracted attention from his supervisors. When questioned about his behavior, Chen Bao broke down and confessed not only to his sexual relationship with Li Wei, but to helping other concubines dispose of evidence from similar situations. His testimony revealed that the practice Li Wei had discovered in ancient texts was not an isolated historical curiosity, but a survival strategy that had been revived and refined by desperate women facing impossible circumstances. Chen Bao described helping at least 6 different concubines through the process over the past 2 years, providing medical assistance during clandestine births and helping dispose of evidence. He claimed the women had convinced him they were performing a mercy that spared their children from worse fates, but his growing psychological deterioration suggested he was no longer able to rationalize his participation. The investigation culminated when Chen Yingshan's agents discovered Li Wei's hidden cache of ancient medical texts, copied by hand from rare manuscripts in the palace library and annotated with practical notes about implementing the consumption rituals. These documents provided detailed evidence of premeditation that made it impossible to dismiss her actions as temporary madness or spontaneous desperation. Emperor Kangxi, when presented with the full scope of the investigation, initially refused to believe what his agents had uncovered. The idea that women in his own palace had been consuming their own children seemed too monstrous to accept, even for a ruler who had witnessed every form of human depravity that political power could reveal. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the implications extended far beyond the individual cases that had triggered the investigation. If such practices were occurring in the Imperial Harem, it suggested that the palace system itself had created pressures so intense that they were driving women to acts that challenged the basic foundations of human nature. The emperor's reaction would prove decisive, not just for Li Wei and the other women involved, but for the future structure of the Imperial Harem and the count what their desperation had drifted siphon on his jum. As news of the investigation began to circulate through the palace's unofficial communication networks, a sense of terror settled over the inner chambers that went beyond fear of punishment. The women of the harem began to realize that their carefully constructed world of survival strategies and mutual support had been exposed, leaving them vulnerable to consequences that none of them had fully anticipated when they first chose to cross the line between human and inhuman acts. Emperor Kangxi's response to the investigation's findings revealed the complex psychology of absolute power when confronted with the unintended consequences of its own system. Rather than ordering immediate executions as many in the court expected, the young emperor spent 3 days in private meditation, consulting with Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks, and the palace's most senior advisors about how to process what had been uncovered in his own household. The philosophical implications troubled him more than the practical ones. If women in his imperial harem were driven to consume their own children, What did that say about the moral foundation of his rule, and the system he had inherited from his predecessors? Kangxi's final judgment reflected both pragmatism and a disturbing form of mercy that would reshape palace life for generations. Li Wei and the 5 other concubines identified in the investigation would not be executed, but they would be subjected to a punishment that some scholars argue was more cruel than death. Complete erasure from imperial records, followed by exile to the Palace of Compassionate Tranquility, a section of the Forbidden City reserved for women who had committed acts too shameful for public acknowledgement. This punishment, known as living death, meant that the women would spend the remainder of their lives in complete isolation, forbidden from speaking to anyone except designated palace physicians, their names struck from all official records as if they had never existed. They would be fed simple meals, pushed through slots in their doors, allowed no visitors, no correspondence, and no contact with the outside world, until natural death released them from what amounted to solitary confinement. Chen Bao faced a different fate that reflected the emperor's particular anger at his deception about the castration. Rather than execution, he was subjected to completion of the process, a procedure that removed the remaining parts of his anatomy that had allowed him to father children, followed by assignment to the palace's waste disposal department, where he would spend his remaining years managing the removal of human excrement from the imperial quarters. The symbolism was deliberate. A man who had helped women dispose of inconvenient evidence would himself become responsible for disposing of the palace's most shameful waste products. But the investigation's most lasting impact wasn't in its punishments, but in the systematic changes it triggered throughout the imperial harem system. Kangxi ordered the implementations from developing in the future, though the solutions he chose reflected a limited understanding of the desperation that had driven the women to their extreme acts. Concubines would now be subject to monthly medical examinations that included detailed tracking of menstrual cycles, body weight changes, and physical signs of pregnancy. Any woman who became pregnant would be immediately moved to special quarters under constant supervision, ensuring that births could not occur in secret and that all children born in the palace would be properly documented. Most significantly, the emperor instituted a new policy regarding children born to lower-ranking concubines. Rather than leaving their fate uncertain, all imperial children would now be officially acknowledged and provided with basic support, regardless of their mother's status or the circumstances of their conception. This change, while appearing merciful, had potential threat to existing power structures. The women who remained in the palace after the purge understood that the new system offered different opportunities for manipulation and survival, but the fundamental pressures that had driven their sisters to cannibalism remained unchanged. If anything, the increased surveillance made the environment more oppressive, with concubines now living under constant observation by eunuch monitors, whose job was to report any unusual behavior or suspicious activities. The Palace of Compassionate Tranquility, meanwhile, became a ghost story that haunted the remaining women's imagination. Servants reported strange sounds coming from that section of the Forbidden City, weeping that seemed to echo through the corridors at night, and occasionally, voices that seemed to be speaking to children who were no longer there. Li Wei, in her isolation, experienced psychological deterioration that palace physicians documented but were powerless to treat. She developed elaborate conversations with her deceased son, speaking to him for hours each day as if he were present in her cell, feeding him imaginary meals, and singing lullabies to Emperor. The physicians noted that she seemed to believe the consumption ritual had been successful in keeping his spirit close to her, but the comfort this provided was mixed with torment. Chen Bao's fate proved equally tragic, though in different ways. His work in the waste management department provided him with detailed knowledge of the palace's most intimate secrets. Concubines were genuinely pregnant, which were using herbal preparations to prevent conception, and which were exhibiting the physical signs of stress that had preceded the previous crisis. This knowledge tortured him because he was forbidden from acting on it, or warning anyone about patterns he could see developing. He watched as new women entered the system full of hope and ambition, knowing that some of them would eventually face the same impossible choices that had destroyed Li Wei and the others. The broader implications of the scandal extended beyond the Forbidden City into Chinese society as a whole. Word of the investigation leaked beyond the palace walls, despite official attempts at secrecy, creating widespread discussion about the pressures faced by women in imperial service and the moral costs of maintaining absolute monarchy. Some scholars began questioning whether the harem system itself was compatible with Confucian values of family harmony. The debate revealed deep tensions in Chinese society between idealized concepts of motherhood and the practical realities of women's lives, in systems designed primarily to serve male authority. Folktales began circulating about the hungry mothers of the Forbidden City, stories that combined horror with sympathy. As common people tried to process the idea that even the most privileged women in the empire could be driven to such desperate acts, these stories often portrayed the women as victims of a system that valued them only for their reproductive capacity, while providing no real security or protection for their children. But they also reflected deep cultural anxieties about the nature of motherhood itself, and what might happen when the bonds between mothers and children were subjected to pressures that exceeded natural limits. In the quiet years that followed, the Forbidden City settled into new rhythms that incorporated the lessons of the investigation while maintaining the fundamental structures that had created the original crisis. New concubines entering the palace were told carefully edited versions of what had happened, warnings designed to deter similar behavior without revealing the full extent of what their predecessors had been driven to do. The Palace of Compassionate Tranquility remained occupied, its residents growing older and more disconnected from reality as the years passed, living reminders of what the pursuit of survival could cost when pushed beyond all reasonable boundaries. Li Wei lived another 12 years in her isolation, her conversations with her absent son eventually fading into a silence that the palace physicians found more disturbing than her previous delusions. When she finally died in the winter of 1680, the official record noted simply that a woman of no importance had passed away in the palace, her name already forgotten by history. But in the deeper archives, where palace scribes kept the records that were never meant for public viewing, her story remained as a warning about the human cost of systems that treat survival as a game, with winners and losers rather than a basic right that should be guaranteed to all participants. The concubines who came after learned to navigate the new surveillance and restrictions, developing different strategies for survival that were perhaps less extreme but no less desperate in their own ways. The fundamental mathematics of the harem remained unchanged. Too many women competing for too few opportunities, with consequences for failure that made almost any sacrifice seem reasonable. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace settled into its deepest sleep, some said you could still hear echoes of those long-ago conversations between Li Wei and the child she had loved enough to destroy, their voices carrying across the centuries like a whispered reminder that even the most unthinkable acts can emerge from the most ordinary desires for love and survival. The Forbidden City continued to house its thousands of inhabitants, the daily routines of court life proceeding with the same elaborate ceremony that had characterized imperial power for centuries. But beneath the surface of silk and jade, in the spaces between public rituals and private desperation, the memory of what had happened lingered like incense smoke, invisible but unmistakably present, a reminder that even paradise could become a prison when survival itself became a luxury that had to be purchased with pieces of one's ojre. In the end, Li Wei's story became what she had perhaps always known it would become, a cautionary tale about the price of power, not for those who wielded it, but for those whose lives were consumed in its maintenance. Her sacrifice, both of her child and of her own humanity, had purchased nothing more valuable than a few extra years of life in a system that would eventually dispose of her anyway. But in those final moments of consciousness, as winter settled over Beijing for the last time in her life, perhaps she found some peace in the knowledge that she had loved her son enough to spare him the pain of growing up in a world where love itself could become a weapon, and where the greatest mercy a mother could offer might be to ensure her child never had to learn what survival really cost in the shadows of absolute power. The golden walls of the Forbidden City held many secrets, but none quite so terrible as the love that had driven a desperate woman to consume her own child, believing that in doing so she was saving them both from something even worse than death. And in the quiet spaces where such stories are kept, Li Wei's whispered lullabies can to something unrecognizable, but somehow, impossibly, still recognizable as love, kind of love that exists only in places where human beings are pushed so far beyond their naksha. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and may your own rest be untroubled by the desperate mathematics of survival that once turned a mother's love into something the world was not prepared to understand or forgive.